The solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between overdue library notices and a journal subscription renewal. Raj, hunched over his dissertation, had initially dismissed it as another administrative banality. His specialty, the esoteric intersection of obscure maritime folklore and forgotten coastal communities, rarely drew the attention of legal professionals. The envelope, however, bore an unfamiliar crest and an address in a small Maine town he'd never heard of. Curiosity, a driving force in his academic pursuits, compelled him to tear it open. The contents were succinct, formal, and startling. Raj, it stated, was the sole beneficiary of an estate belonging to a distant relative he barely remembered, a great-aunt twice removed, who had lived a reclusive life. The inheritance, a lighthouse. Specifically, the Blackwood Point Lighthouse on Blackwood Isle off the coast of Maine. The phrasing was deliberately neutral, but the implications settled heavily in the quiet of his small, book-lined apartment. A lighthouse on a remote island. His initial skepticism quickly gave way to a peculiar thrill. His dissertation, a sprawling exploration of pre-colonial fishing rituals and their connection to deep-sea mythologies, had stalled. The endless hum of city life, the perpetual deadlines, the fluorescent glare of the university library. None fostered the singular focus required to delve into such ancient, submerged narratives. A lighthouse, isolated and steeped in history, presented an unexpected opportunity. It could be the perfect crucible for his research, a silent, windswept sanctuary where the whispers of the past might finally resonate. He imagined long nights, the rhythmic beam sweeping across the ocean, the raw, untamed environment fueling his academic rigor. The journey began 2 weeks later. The interstate highways gradually dissolved into winding state routes, then narrower county roads, each mile shedding layers of civilization. The landscape shifted from manicured suburbs to dense ancient forests that pressed close to the asphalt, their shadows deep and secretive. Cell service became sporadic, then non-existent. The air grew sharper, carrying the distinct metallic tang of salt and pine. He reached the small coastal town that served as the mainland's last outpost. It was a collection of weathered shacks, a general store, and a single rickety dock. A solitary figure, a man with a face like sun-baked leather and eyes the color of a stormy sea, emerged from a small shanty beside the dock. This was the ferryman, Raj presumed, the only link to Blackwood Isle. "You the academic?" the ferryman rasped, his voice gravelly, his gaze sweeping over Raj's sensible sedan and then lingering on his face with an unsettling intensity. Raj confirmed it. The man merely grunted, gesturing towards a squat, rust-streaked vessel tethered to the dock. Its name, the Mariner's End, seemed less a promise of safe passage and more a grim premonition. The crossing was slow, the ferry pushing through water the color of lead, indistinguishable from the low, swirling fog. The mainland receded, dissolving into the pervasive gray. For a long hour, there was nothing but the churn of the engine, the slap of waves against the hull, and the mournful wail of an unseen buoy. The isolation was profound, a physical presence that pressed in from all sides. He felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that transcended mere physical discomfort. Blackwood Isle. It rose from the water like a jagged tooth, its craggy shores swallowed by the encroaching fog. Perched precariously on its highest point, a gaunt, skeletal finger reaching toward the sky, stood the lighthouse. Even from this distance, its dilapidation was evident. A peeling white paint that suggested long neglect. A rusted lantern room that looked like a vacant eye socket. The ferry bumped against a rudimentary dock carved into the island's rock face. No welcoming party awaited. The ferryman unloaded Raj's bags without a word, then turned his boat back towards the mainland, its engine fading into the fog until only the distant wail of the buoy remained. Raj was utterly alone. A narrow, overgrown track, barely visible beneath a layer of damp leaves and gnarled roots, wound its way up from the dock. As he walked, The path briefly opened onto a desolate expanse to his left. A sheet of gray ice, scarred by winter's grip and framed by skeletal pines, stretched out towards the interior of the island. The frozen lake, he realized, remembering a brief mention on the old map, its stillness profound, its surface reflecting the leaden sky like a shattered mirror. Finally, he stood before the lighthouse. It was larger than he had anticipated, a hulking monument of gray stone and weather-beaten wood. The structure felt less like a beacon and more like a tombstone. The smell of brine was overwhelming, mixed with the acrid scent of rust and something else. A faint, earthy decay that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The wind, a constant mournful presence, whistled through unseen cracks, a low keening sound that suggested lament. The iron lantern room at the top was a skeletal cage of rusted metal and shattered glass, its powerful lens long gone. The entrance door, a heavy slab of oak, was warped and splintered, its brass handle green with verdigris. It felt impossibly ancient, not merely old in years, but possessing a deep, forgotten history, as if it had absorbed the very essence of the sea and the secrets it guarded. A subtle vibration seemed to hum beneath his palm, a low, resonant thrumming that was almost imperceptible, yet distinctly there. It was a feeling of immense, latent energy, a unique, ritualistic pulse that defied logical explanation. He felt a profound sense of unease, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of the climb. This was not merely a quiet retreat. It was a structure imbued with a profound and unsettling presence. The ferryman, a man of few words and weathered hands, had deposited Raj and his meager belongings on the rocky shore of the island with a curt nod. The chug of his engine quickly swallowed by the omnipresent fog. The lighthouse loomed, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its whitewash flaking, the glass of its lantern room opaque with salt and neglect. Raj had surveyed the structure, a determined glint in his eye despite the pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones. This was it, his retreat, his sanctuary. The initial days were a blur of unpacking and preliminary exploration. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the pervasive grime. Each step on the creaking wooden floors echoed, a hollow sound that seemed to linger. He found the kitchen first, a utilitarian space with a rusted iron stove and a hand pump that, miraculously, still drew brackish water. The living quarters were Spartan, a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a single high window overlooking the churning gray sea. He set up his laptop on the table, surrounded by stacks of books on obscure cults and forgotten maritime tragedies. He spent hours meticulously cleaning, sweeping away generations of accumulated dust and cobwebs. During one of these cleaning sessions, behind a loose panel in the wall of the circular keeper's office, Raj discovered a stack of bound volumes. Their covers were stiff leather, warped by damp, the pages within yellowed and brittle. Logbooks. The first entry was dated 1888. He settled at the old, scarred desk, carefully opening the oldest logbook. The script was spidery, faded ink documenting weather patterns, supply deliveries, and the occasional ship sighting. But interspersed between these mundane entries, Raj began to notice peculiar annotations. Sketches of strange, angular symbols appeared in the margins, repeated with increasing frequency in later years. They were not nautical charts or weather symbols. They resembled something primal, almost glyph-like, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. Some pages contained only these symbols, scrawled in a frantic hand, accompanied by increasingly erratic dates. The last entry in the oldest book simply read, "The lights falter, they sing, always." Later, while tracing the cold stone of the inner tower wall, his fingers brushed against a rough patch. He scraped away a century of lime wash and found them. The same symbols, deeply incised into the granite. Not painted, not drawn, but carved with deliberate force. They spiraled upwards, almost imperceptibly, just beneath the paint, following the curve of the tower. He felt a prickle of unease. These were not the casual doodles of a bored keeper. They were deliberate, pervasive, and unsettlingly familiar from his studies of ancient pre-human mythologies. The first anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed. Raj attributed it to old wiring, the salt air, or perhaps the persistent damp. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on stone, would drift up from the lower levels, especially at night. He imagined rats or the ceaseless settling of the ancient structure. The wind, he told himself, was playing tricks. One afternoon, he ventured out, determined to explore the island beyond the immediate vicinity of the lighthouse. The fog, a dense, swirling shroud, made visibility poor, but he pressed on, guided by the distant rumble of the sea. He found a small, brackish pond inland, its surface a sheet of dull, gray ice. He stood for a long moment, feeling utterly alone, utterly insignificant. The island felt less like a retreat and more like a cage, its boundaries defined by the indifferent, churning ocean. He hurried back, the stark isolation of the island pressing in on him. Back within the familiar, if unsettling confines of the lighthouse, the feeling of being observed intensified. He would turn abruptly, expecting to see nothing, just the empty, echoing spaces of the lighthouse. The flickering lights became more frequent, the scratching sounds more distinct, sometimes accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Raj would grip the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, and tell himself it was the wind, the old pipes, the generator. He was isolated, sleep-deprived, and perhaps his mind was beginning to play tricks. He needed to finish his dissertation. This was just the building settling. It had to be. Yet, the conviction in his own rationalizations was beginning to fray at the edges, like the tattered pages of an ancient, forgotten book. He found himself pausing, listening, holding his breath, waiting for the next anomaly, the next whisper in the profound, heavy silence. The symbols, etched with such deliberate force into the granite, had left Raj with a chilling certainty. This was not a mere aberration, not some forgotten graffiti. They were integral to the lighthouse, woven into its very foundation, and they mirrored the unsettling designs on the old keeper's journal. The isolation, once a cherished quiet, now felt like a shroud. He needed human contact, a grounding force against the unsettling silence of the tower, and he needed answers that the dusty texts could not provide. The path to the village was a narrow, winding track, barely more than a deer trail, slick with perpetual dampness. Mist clung to the stunted pines, muffling the already distant roar of the ocean. He walked with a determined stride, the crunch of his boots on the gravel the only sound for what felt like miles. Through a momentary thinning of the fog, he caught a glimpse of the island's interior, a vast gray expanse of scrubland, and in the distance, a glint of dull ice. A single rickety dock jutted into the churning water, a few fishing boats bobbing restlessly. No children played in the narrow lanes, no dogs barked a welcome. A profound quiet, different from the lighthouses, hung in the air, a quiet born of vigilance and long-held secrets. He found the general store by the faint glow of a bare bulb through its grimy window. The interior smelled of dried fish, kerosene, and damp wool. Behind a counter piled high with an assortment of goods, an elderly man with a face like wind-carved stone looked up slowly. His eyes, the color of sea glass, narrowed. "Morning," Raj offered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Just looking for some supplies." The shopkeeper nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. He moved with a stiff deliberation, gathering the few items Raj requested: flour, dried beans, a fresh block of cheese. His movements were economical, his gaze unreadable. Raj felt an invisible barrier between them, a palpable reserve. "You're the new keeper, then," the shopkeeper finally rasped, his voice gravelly as he placed the items on the counter. It wasn't a question. "Raj," he corrected gently. "Yes, Raj am. Just inherited the place." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's quite isolated and old." The shopkeeper grunted, pushing a tin of hardtack towards him. "Old it is, older than any of us know." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the small, fogged window. Lighthouse has seen a lot, more than any man should. Raj seized the opening. "I've been looking through some of the previous keeper's things. Journals, logs. There are some strange entries." The shopkeeper's jaw tightened. He picked up a rag and began to wipe down the already clean counter, his movements slow and deliberate. "Some men, they don't take to the isolation well. See things, hear things. But these aren't just ramblings," Raj pressed, lowering his voice. "There are symbols, carvings, and talk of things in the fog." The shopkeeper stopped wiping, his eyes now sharp and direct, fixed on Raj. "You'd do well to leave those things alone, young man. It brings things, not just the damp." Another local, a stout woman with calloused hands, entered the store, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. He paused, sensing the charged atmosphere, and his eyes flickered between Raj and the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper straightened, his expression reverting to its previous guarded neutrality. Raj paid for his supplies, the weight of the coins feeling heavier than usual in his palm. As he turned to leave, the shopkeeper's voice stopped him. "The last keeper. He wasn't found, just gone. And the one before him, he went mad, they say. It calls to things, draws them in." Outside, the fog seemed to have thickened, pressing in on the village, obscuring the few houses he had seen. The locals knew. They feared it. And their fear, raw and palpable, was a far more concrete warning than any cryptic journal entry. He gripped the canvas bag of supplies, the ordinary weight of it a small comfort against the profound unease that now settled deep in his bones. The path back to the lighthouse, shrouded in the encroaching gray, felt less like a journey home and more like an inevitable return to a waiting predator. The fog outside pressed against the tower's thick glass, a gray, shifting shroud that seemed to absorb all sound. Raj stood by a window, the shopkeeper's clipped words echoing in his mind, suggesting a deeper, more pervasive strangeness than he had initially conceded. He had attributed the previous oddities to isolation, to the creaking of an old structure, or to his own overactive academic imagination. This rationalization, however, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. A book, a heavy tome on North Atlantic currents, lay open on his desk. He had left it spine up, a clear marker. Now it rested face down, several pages further along than he remembered. He stared at it, a tremor of unease rippling through him. He picked it up, feeling its weight, its cold, dry paper. A draft, perhaps. He checked the window latches, finding them secure. Later that evening, as he sorted through a box of old charts, a distinct whisper brushed past his ear. It was not the wind. The air was still within the room. It was guttural, a sound like water rushing over stones, yet it carried an intonation, an almost human quality. He froze, his hand hovering over a faded map of the local coastline. He rubbed his arm, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. These isolated incidents, once dismissed, now accumulated into a disquieting pattern. His academic training, a reflex of ordered inquiry, compelled him to seek answers. If the phenomena were real, they demanded investigation. He turned to the lighthouse's hidden archives, a small, damp-smelling room tucked beneath the main spiral staircase, accessible only by a stiff wooden door he had previously overlooked. Inside, Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through a grimy pane. Stacked shelves held ledgers, logbooks, and brittle, yellowed newspapers. He spent the next days immersed in the island's forgotten past. The air in the archive was thick with the scent of mildew and decaying paper, a smell that clung to his clothes and hair. He meticulously cataloged log entries, cross-referenced shipping records, and deciphered archaic handwriting. The earliest lighthouse logs, dating back to the late 1700s, were remarkably detailed, chronicling weather patterns, vessel sightings, and even the mundane repairs to the lamp. Yet he noticed jarring discontinuities. Entire weeks were sometimes missing from specific keepers' logs. Not just blank pages, but pages physically excised, leaving ragged edges. Other entries, particularly during certain storm cycles, abruptly shifted in penmanship, as if a different hand had taken over, the script bolder, less refined, almost frantic. These sections often contained vague, unsettling remarks about the deep, unnatural tides, or the call. His research extended to the small village's historical records, kept in a musty back room of the general store. The shopkeeper, taciturn and watchful, merely nodded when Raj requested access. Accounts of the island's early settlers frequently mentioned its harsh beauty, its abundant fishing grounds, but skirted around certain events or periods. A recurring theme emerged, a pervasive fear of the sea, not just its storms, but something intrinsic to its depths. One particular passage, a fragmented journal entry from a missionary, detailed a blasphemous ritual performed by the island's earliest inhabitants near a frozen lake during a winter of unprecedented severity. The entry then abruptly ceased. Raj began to piece together the fragments. The symbols he had observed carved into the lighthouse's foundation, previously dismissed as weathered ornamentation, now seemed to resonate with the descriptions in the old texts. They were not merely decorative, but appeared to be a stylized ancient script, often depicted alongside crude sketches of undulating forms or strange, multi-limbed entities. He cross-referenced these with his academic knowledge of obscure maritime myths and forbidden lore, finding unsettling parallels. Similar symbols, often associated with cults devoted to pre-human entities or primordial forces, appeared in isolated coastal communities across the globe, always linked to the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the ocean. The realization settled over him with the weight of a physical burden. This was not mere folklore or local superstition. This was a narrative deliberately suppressed, a history meticulously erased. The lighthouse, isolated and exposed, was not just a beacon for ships. It seemed to be a focal point, a receiver, or perhaps even a transmitter for something ancient and vast. They were a response, a burgeoning activity. The mystery was far deeper than he had imagined, stretching beyond the island's shores, down into the crushing pressure of the lightless deep, and whatever it was stirring. The general store's back room smelled of aged paper and forgotten dust. Raj meticulously sifted through ledgers and journals, each page a testament to a history deliberately pruned. The shopkeeper, a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much fog, offered no assistance, only a lingering presence near the doorway. The island's past, as recorded here, was a series of vague mentions and sudden gaps. Entire decades vanished from the narrative, particularly those preceding the construction of the lighthouse. Raj noted a recurring motif, a great loss, or unusual tide, that seemed to erase memory, not just people. That night, the gaps in the records began to manifest in Raj's sleep. His dreams, usually a quiet procession of academic theories and research notes, twisted into a maelstrom of sound and shadow. He stood on a precipice, the wind of physical assault tearing at his clothes. Below, the churning sea clawed at black rocks, not with the familiar rhythm of waves, but with a guttural, hungry roar. Then, a single piercing shriek cut through the tempest, a sound of absolute despair, not human, yet resonating with an ancient, profound agony. He saw shapes in the foam, fleeting and indistinct, like colossal, boneless forms writhing just beneath the surface, their movements too fluid, too vast to belong to any known creature. He woke abruptly, the taste of salt and fear on his tongue, the shriek still echoing in the cavern of his skull. The lighthouse beam swept through his window, briefly illuminating the room, then plunging it back into the oppressive dark. The following days blurred. The isolation, once a cherished solitude, began to press in, heavy and suffocating. The air in the lighthouse felt thick, laden with an unseen presence. He found himself staring out at the ocean for hours, his research forgotten. A low, insistent hum, just beneath the threshold of hearing, seemed to emanate from the depths, a sound that resonated deep in his bones. It was a call, subtle at first, then growing in its insidious pull, drawing him towards the very edge of the island, towards the churning gray expanse. His sleep offered no respite. The visions grew more vivid, more demanding. He witnessed scenes not from his own life, but from the island's forgotten past. He saw a small, desolate village, its houses cowering against a relentless blizzard. The air was frigid, biting, and a vast, unbroken sheet of ice stretched out where the sea should have been. On its slick surface, small flickering points of light, like lanterns, danced erratically before winking out one by one. Panic gripped the dream figures as the ice groaned, a sound like a tortured beast. Then, a sudden violent crack spiderwebbed across the frozen lake, consuming the lights, swallowing the village in a deafening roar of splintering ice and freezing water. The call intensified during his waking hours. It wasn't a voice, but an impulse, a magnetic tug. It urged him to the lantern room, to stand before the colossal lens, to gaze out at the sea. He felt an inexplicable need to listen to the ocean, to decipher the rhythmic thud and crash of the waves, as if they held a secret meant only for him. He saw things in the water now, not just in dreams. They would appear at the periphery of his vision, then vanish when he focused, leaving him to question if his eyes were playing tricks or if his mind was already beginning to fray. One afternoon, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the island whole, muting all sound save for the mournful bleat of the foghorn. Raj stood in the lantern room, the beam cutting a futile swathe through the impenetrable gray. The hum from the ocean was a roar now, vibrating through the very structure of the lighthouse. He pressed his palms against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. And there, in the swirling vapor, he saw them again. Not distinct shapes, but a presence. A multitude of unseen forms, vast and ancient, shifting just beyond the reach of the light, their movements mirroring the grotesque undulations he'd witnessed in his nightmares. They were there, in the gray, waiting. He was not just observing these phenomena. He was being observed. The lighthouse, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a conduit, a beacon drawing something immense and hungry from the depths. His academic detachment was crumbling, replaced by a primal, gnawing fear. And the lighthouse, his isolated retreat, was at the very heart of it. The call, now an undeniable current, pulled him closer, promising revelations, or perhaps dissolution. The shopkeeper's dismissive glance still pricked at Raj's thoughts as he navigated the slick, winding path back to the lighthouse. The air, usually crisp with salt, now carried an unnatural stillness. A thick, cloying silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He had found little of substance in the general store's dusty ledgers, only gaps, pages torn out, and entries that abruptly ceased before the island's more peculiar incidents began. It felt deliberate, a history curated for forgetfulness. The first gust hit like a physical blow, rattling the lighthouse's lantern room as Raj ascended the final steps. Rain, not drops, but sheets, immediately lashed against the thick glass, distorting the already fading light of the late afternoon. The wind howled, a deep guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the island, not merely its periphery. He felt the structure sway, a subtle, sickening lurch that made his stomach clench. He tried his satellite phone. No signal. He tried the ancient radio receiver, a relic he'd hoped might offer an emergency channel. Only static, a white noise roar that mirrored the storm outside, an empty, mocking hiss. His laptop, usually reliable, flickered once, then died, its screen going black with an unnerving finality. Every electronic device, every connection to the outside world had simultaneously ceased to function. It wasn't just the storm. It felt targeted. The lighthouse began to groan, not the familiar creak of old wood settling, but a deeper, more resonant complaint. The massive gears of the beacon mechanism, usually silent in their slow rotation, now emitted a strained, metallic shriek with each sweep of the light. The sound scraped along Raj's nerves, making his teeth ache. The light itself, a powerful, steady beam, seemed to falter, its rhythm becoming erratic. It pulsed, dimmed, then surged with an unnerving intensity, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like phantom limbs across the circular walls of the lantern room. Each shift made the familiar space alien, menacing. Raj pressed his face to the rain-streaked glass, peering out into the maelstrom. The sea churned, a boiling cauldron of black and white, waves crashing against the rocks with a force that vibrated through the very foundation of the tower. He saw nothing but the furious elements, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. Was it the shopkeeper's eyes, the wary glances of the few islanders he'd encountered? Had they known this storm was coming? Known it would sever him completely? Or was it something else, something unseen that the storm merely facilitated? A cloak for its presence. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the floor below, followed by a series of groans that sounded almost organic. The wind screamed through unseen gaps, a chorus of tormented voices. On the third landing, where a small, unused storage alcove was built into the wall, he noticed a hairline fracture in the plaster. It hadn't been there an hour ago. A faint, earthy odor, like damp soil and decaying leaves, seeped from it, mingling with the salt tang of the storm. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the brittle edge of the plaster. He widened the opening, pulling away more of the fragile material until a small, recessed cavity was exposed. Inside, nestled amongst dry, brittle dust, lay a single, flat, polished stone. The symbols seemed to shift, to subtly rearrange themselves in the dim, flickering light from the lantern room above. He turned it over, his gaze drawn to a larger, more pronounced symbol on its reverse side. A jagged, inverted triangle resembling a tooth or a claw, with a single horizontal line bisecting its upper half. It felt ancient, impossibly old, and utterly alien. A sudden, violent gust struck the lighthouse, shaking it to its core. The beacon light above flickered wildly, then pulsed with an unnatural, sickly green hue for a terrifying instant, illuminating the storm-ravaged landscape outside. Through the narrow, high window on the landing, beyond the thrashing trees and the raging sea, Raj saw it. A brief, stark glimpse of the island's interior, a stretch of land he knew held the freshwater reservoir. And there, starkly visible under the eerie green glow, was the distinct, smooth expanse of the frozen lake, its surface reflecting the unnatural light like a polished, obsidian eye. She hadn't known it could freeze so quickly or so completely. The lake, the stone, the lighthouse's groans, they were all connected, part of a system he was only just beginning to uncover, a system that now seemed to be closing in around him. He was not merely isolated by the storm, he was trapped within a living, breathing entity, its ancient mechanisms stirring to life. He had found little. The old man had offered no comfort, only suspicion. The lighthouse stood, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its beacon already cutting a slow, deliberate swath through the encroaching gloom. Inside, the chill felt deeper than the evening air. He bypassed the kitchen, ignoring the gnawing hunger, and ascended directly to the lamp room. The hum of the mechanism, usually a soothing rhythm, now felt like a low, incessant thrumming against his teeth. He pulled out the tattered journal he had found earlier, its pages brittle, its ink faded. He also retrieved the strange, rough-hewn wooden block, placing it on the small table. He needed answers, and he needed them now. His research became a desperate, feverish scramble. He pored over his own academic texts on maritime folklore, cross-referencing ancient symbols with the crude carvings on the wooden block. Raj's fingers traced a recurring symbol, 3 concentric circles, bisected by a jagged vertical line. He found a similar motif in an obscure volume on pre-Celtic sea rituals, described as a gate sigil for forces beyond the known world. The text warned against its activation, speaking of the great hunger from below. Hours blurred. The beam of the lighthouse swept methodically through the blackness, each revolution a quiet, relentless pulse. Raj felt a pressure building behind his eyes, a dull throb that mirrored the lighthouse's rhythm. A particularly cryptic passage in the journal caught his attention. The keeper's duty is not to guide, but to bind. The light, a ward, a cage, lest the ice break and the ancient breath stir the land. And then, a few lines later, a precise, almost diagrammatic sketch of the island, with a prominent X marking a spot in the interior, labeled simply, Frozen Lake. The words resonated with a terrifying certainty. Raj felt a sudden, visceral pull towards that place. He grabbed his thickest coat, his movements stiff, almost robotic. The wind outside was a lament, tearing at the windows. As he stepped out, a vision seized him. The lighthouse beam, instead of sweeping the sea, seemed to plunge down, deep into the earth, illuminating a vast cavernous space beneath the island. He tasted salt and something else, something ancient and terrible on his tongue. The path to the frozen lake was treacherous, overgrown and slick with unseen ice beneath the thin layer of snow. The light from the lighthouse was a distant, mocking eye, offering no comfort here in the dense, silent woods. The air was still, utterly devoid of sound, not even the rustle of dry leaves or the snap of twigs underfoot. It was as if the very atmosphere had been muted, absorbing all noise. He stumbled into a clearing. Before him lay the frozen lake, a vast, flat expanse of black ice, reflecting the sparse stars like polished obsidian. It was unnaturally smooth, almost perfectly preserved, despite the fluctuating temperatures of the season. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the ground, rising from beneath the ice, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and reverberate directly in his bones. Then he saw it. It seemed to breathe, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that subtly shifted the ice above it. Cracks, thin as spiderwebs, began to radiate outwards from the center, accompanied by soft groans and sharp, splintering reports. The humming intensified, becoming a low, guttural chant that echoed not from the air, but from the depths. This was the entity. This was the ancient thing the journals hinted at, the horror the locals feared. It was not merely sleeping. It was stirring. The lighthouse, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't a prison for it or even a beacon to it. It was a catalyst. The rhythmic pulse of its light, the very energy it generated, was slowly, meticulously awakening it. Each sweep of its powerful beam, each revolution of its mechanism, was not a warning to ships, but a ritualistic pulse, a feeding, a call. His mind reeled. The great hunger from below wasn't just a metaphor. The light was drawing it forth, nourishing it, making it aware. The cracks on the frozen lake were not just ice fracturing. They were the first visible signs of something immense pushing against its ancient confinement. It was a conscious, ancient entity, and it was waking up. And he, the new keeper, was inadvertently accelerating its emergence. He had not sought refuge here. He had become its unwitting accomplice. The dull throb behind Raj's eyes intensified, a rhythmic pulse that had become an unwelcome echo of the lighthouse's beam. Hours had indeed blurred. The fleeting dark shapes in his peripheral vision no longer dissolved entirely. They lingered, smudges against the periphery of his perception, like stains on the very air. He had spent too long simply observing, too long allowing the insidious pressure to build. A new, colder resolve began to set in, hardening the edges of his fear. He would not simply wither. He moved with a renewed, almost frantic energy, descending from the lantern room. His academic training, once a shield against the irrational, now offered a weapon. He recalled an obscure passage from a brittle, leather-bound text detailing warding rituals against ancient sea-bound entities. Not quite gods, but primal forces. The text spoke of specific sigils, etched into natural materials, and the burning of certain herbs to disrupt a spiritual tether. It was a long shot, born of desperation, but it was something. In the small, cramped study he had carved out for himself, Raj unearthed a worn notebook filled with meticulous transcriptions. His finger traced a particular symbol, a convoluted knot said to sever unseen connections. He found a piece of driftwood, smoothed by years of ocean currents, and with a small, sharp penknife began to carve. The wood resisted, splintering unexpectedly, as if it resented the intrusion. The air in the study grew heavy, pressing in on him. When the carving was finally complete, crude but recognizable, he moved to the small, unlit hearth. He had no specific herbs, but he had dry, brittle kelp he'd collected from the shore, its scent sharp and briny. He ignited it. The smoke, thin and acrid, curled upwards, not dissipating, but hanging in the air like a shroud. A low groan vibrated through the stone walls, a sound that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the lighthouse, deep beneath the churning waves. Raj stood his ground, clutching the carved driftwood. The pressure behind his eyes became a sharp stab. The entity was aware. It was displeased. The folklore attempt was a failure, or at least insufficient. The entity had merely swatted at his effort, a dismissive gesture of its immense power. Raj's resolve, though battered, shifted. If symbolic disruption wouldn't work, then physical sabotage might. The lighthouse's light, its mechanical heart, was the key. If he could disable it, perhaps he could break the connection, sever the ritualistic energy that fed the ancient horror. He reached the lantern room door, its heavy brass handle frigid to the touch. He twisted it, but the mechanism refused to yield, jammed tight. He pulled, pushed, then kicked, a desperate thud against the unyielding metal. The door remained shut, mocking him. He tried the generator room door on a lower floor. Same result. It was not mere rust or neglect. The lighthouse itself was resisting him. Frustration clawed at him, a raw, desperate feeling. He was trapped, his every effort countered. His gaze fell upon the small, tarnished compass he kept in his pocket, a gift from his grandfather. He needed to escape, if only to think, to breathe air not thick with ancient malevolence. Perhaps there, away from the lighthouse's direct influence, he could clear his head or find some other means of fighting back. The wind howled around him as he stepped outside, a mournful, hungry sound. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing the landscape, reducing visibility to a few feet. He pushed through the tangled undergrowth, the branches clawing at his coat, the damp earth sucking at his boots. The air was heavy with the scent of brine and decaying kelp, but beneath it, a faint metallic tang, like old blood. The journey was a struggle against the island itself. Trees, their branches skeletal in the fog, seemed to shift, blocking his path, forcing him into detours. The ground became uneven, littered with unseen rocks and treacherous roots. He stumbled, catching himself before falling. He was no longer just walking. He was being actively hindered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned. Before him lay the frozen lake, a vast gray expanse under the heavy, low sky. A profound quiet settled over the scene, broken only by the distant, rhythmic groan of the lighthouse's foghorn, a sound that now seemed less a warning and more a lament. Raj walked onto the ice, each step a tentative crunch. The surface was smooth, almost black in places where the ice was thickest, offering a terrifying transparency into the dark water below. He stood in the center, a solitary figure on a fragile plane. He looked down. Through the murky depths, he saw nothing, but he felt an immense presence. A crushing weight beneath the surface, stirring. The ice beneath his feet began to groan, a low, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the soles of his boots. A sound that was not the natural settling of ice, but something deeper, more alive. A terrible realization settled over Raj. It was not just the lighthouse, not just the immediate vicinity. The entity's reach extended across the island, through the very earth and water. It had allowed him to come here, to this place of deceptive calm, only to demonstrate the futility of his efforts. He was not fighting a localized haunting. He was contending with something that permeated the entire landscape, an ancient power woven into the fabric of this remote world. His options, once seemingly vast, had dwindled to almost nothing. The entity had merely been playing with him. The game, he now understood, was far from over. Hours had indeed blurred. The fleeting dark shapes in his peripheral vision no longer dissolved entirely. They lingered, smudges against the periphery of his perception, like residual soot on a grimy pane. He felt a profound weariness settle in his bones, yet a frantic energy propelled him through the lighthouse's forgotten spaces. The need to understand, to peel back the layers of dust and silence, had become an obsession, eclipsing all other concerns. His search had led him to the lowest level, below the storage room where the storm lanterns and coiled ropes lay. A rusted iron door, almost camouflaged against the damp stone, had yielded with a groan to his insistent prying. Beyond it lay a narrow, descending passage, airless and thick with the scent of brine and decaying paper. The descent was steep, winding like a forgotten route, until it opened into a circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock. This was not a cellar for provisions. In the center of the room, a large, rough-hewn stone altar dominated the space. Its surface was scarred with deep, concentric grooves, radiating outwards from a central depression. Raj ran his hand along the etched patterns, tracing their intricate, almost organic flow. They were not decorative. They looked like channels, designed to collect and direct. Around the altar, embedded in the rock floor, were a series of crude iron rings, each one rusted to a deep, flaky orange. Chains, thick and heavy, lay coiled beside some of them, their links fused by corrosion. Raj's breath hitched. This was a place of purpose, a place of grim function. His academic mind, trained to categorize and rationalize, struggled to process the implications of what lay before him. On a ledge carved into the wall, partially obscured by a fallen slab of rock, he found it. A leather-bound logbook, its cover warped and brittle, its pages swollen and fragile. Its script was an archaic hand, dense and spidery, belonging to a previous keeper, judging by the scattered entries detailing weather and supply runs. But as Raj carefully turned the pages, the mundane entries gave way to something else entirely. The tone shifted, the language growing increasingly desperate, fragmented. The light demands more than oil. The sea grows hungry. The bargain, it falters. Raj's fingers trembled as he continued. The entry spoke of the deep hum, of the drawing, of the tribute. There were references to specific dates marked with unsettling symbols, descriptions of how the heart of the island would call its price. One passage, scrawled in a frantic hand, detailed a journey during a particularly brutal winter. The path to the frozen lake was treacherous, but the offering, it must be made, for the island's peace, for the keeping of the dark waters. The frozen lake. Raj had seen it marked on an old, faded map of the island he'd found in the lighthouse library. A small, isolated body of water in the island's interior, far from the coast. He'd dismissed it as a geographical curiosity. The logbook described a binding ritual, a sacrifice of will that kept the hunger at bay. It spoke of the lighthouse not merely as a guide for ships, but as a crucible, a focal point for energies both terrestrial and profoundly alien. The light, the keeper had written, was not just visible, it was active. It didn't just warn, it drew and contained. And the keeper, he realized with a sickening lurch, was not merely an attendant. The keeper was the conduit. As he read, the faint rhythmic thrumming of the lighthouse mechanism above intensified, vibrating through the stone floor beneath his feet. It was no longer just a mechanical sound. It felt resonant, alive, an enormous pulsating heart. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. The final entries in the logbook were almost illegible, a frantic scrawl that devolved into jagged lines and smudged ink. It returns. The bargain breaks. The heart of the island calls for renewal. A new price. Raj's breath caught in his throat. They were symptoms of a failing containment, a desperate plea from the island itself. The lighthouse was not a sanctuary. It was a prison, and he, Raj, had walked willingly into its cell, just as the last keeper had. And the bargain, it seemed, was now due. The name, Frozen Lake, echoed in Raj's mind like a shard of ice. A late and terrifying piece of a puzzle he had been unwittingly assembling. He had dismissed it, a mere geographical annotation on a crumbling chart. Yet its recent mention by the old fisherman had imbued it with a chilling significance. The cold, the impossible stillness, the idea of something ancient trapped beneath that perpetual sheet of ice, it gnawed at him, a fresh wound in an already ravaged mind. He stumbled through the biting wind back towards the lighthouse, his legs heavy, each step a conscious effort. The island's craggy terrain felt alien beneath his boots, the familiar path now a treacherous ascent. His breath plumed in ragged bursts, his chest aching with the effort and a profound, bone-deep weariness. The sea roared around the island, a relentless, hungry sound that usually offered a strange comfort, but now it seemed to mock him, a primal laugh in the encroaching gloom. Inside the lighthouse, the silence was immediate and profound, a heavy blanket that muffled even the distant crash of waves. The air, usually thick with the scent of salt and old paper, now carried a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or something far older, long buried and newly unearthed. He moved through the ground floor, his hand trailing along the rough-hewn stone walls. They felt different tonight, subtly vibrating, a low hum beneath his fingertips that he initially dismissed as his own trembling. He ascended the spiral staircase, the iron steps groaning under his weight, each clang reverberating with unnatural longevity. His head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He tried to focus, to recall the obscure texts, the folklore of the islanders, the cryptic warnings that had once seemed like quaint superstitions. The frozen lake, its position, isolated in the island's interior, far from the coastal rituals, yet somehow integral. He felt a sickening lurch of understanding. It was not a place of containment, but a focus, a lens. Reaching the lantern room, Raj gripped the brass railing, his knuckles white. The massive lens, usually a beacon of order and purpose, now seemed to pulse with an inner light independent of the lamp. The beam, which should have cut a clean swathe through the deepening fog, instead appeared diffused, warped, as if struggling through an invisible viscous medium. He squinted, trying to clear his vision, but the distortion persisted. Streaks of impossible colors, deep violets, sickly greens, bled into the fog, painting the world outside in an ephemeral, unearthly glow. His gaze fell upon the sea. The water, a churning black expanse, was not behaving as it should. Instead of waves breaking and receding, there were vast, slow undulations, like the flexing of an immense, unseen muscle beneath the surface. The sea itself seemed to be breathing, a slow, titanic exhalation that made the very air in the lantern room shudder. He pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. Through the swirling mist and the distorted light, he saw movement. A low thrum began in the very bones of the lighthouse, a deep, resonant vibration that coursed through the stone, through the iron, and into Raj's own skeleton. His teeth rattled. The sound was not mechanical. It was organic, a gargantuan pulse. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. He choked, clawing at his throat, his lungs burning. His mind reeled. Was this real? Or was his exhaustion, his isolation, finally fracturing his sanity? He pinched his arm, a sharp, stinging pain that momentarily grounded him. But the lighthouse continued to hum, the light continued to distort, and the sea continued its unnatural rhythmic heave. He was not hallucinating. This was happening. The walls of the lantern room began to weep. Not water, but a thin, viscous slime that glistened with the impossible colors of the distorted light. It oozed from the mortar, thick and slow, smelling of brine and something utterly alien. It was everywhere, crawling along the glass, dripping onto the floor, coating the brass with a slick, iridescent film. Raj stumbled back, his foot slipping in the growing pool of effluvium. He fell hard, the impact jarring his teeth. He looked up at the lens, at the very source of the lighthouse's purpose. The light within it was no longer steady. It flared, pulsed, and then dimmed, as if struggling against an immense, unseen pressure. The glass itself seemed to ripple, to become fluid, reflecting impossible geometries that shifted and reformed with dizzying speed. A sound began then, not from the sea, nor from the wind, but from within the lighthouse itself. It was a sound of immense age, of unimaginable size, a sound that spoke of endless depths and forgotten eons. It was the sound of something waking. Raj pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was not external. It was inside him, resonating in his bones, vibrating in the very marrow of his being. His determination, once a fierce flame, flickered and threatened to extinguish. His body felt heavy, leaden, his muscles screaming in protest. His vision swam, the walls of the lantern room seeming to recede and swell like a monstrous, slow-breathing lung. The lighthouse, his sanctuary, was no longer a structure of stone and iron. It was a living, breathing thing, subsumed, becoming an extension of the entity that had stirred beneath the waves, drawn by its ancient, ritualistic energy. The phrase frozen lake had finally coalesced into something terrifyingly concrete within Raj's mind. It wasn't just a place. It was a pivot, the silent, frigid heart of the island's ancient horror. The old fisherman's words, a casual remark about the island's geography, now felt like a final, deliberate clue placed for him to stumble upon. Raj remembered the faded chart, its lines smudged with age, marking a depression on the island's northernmost tip, unusually deep, labeled only with that chilling annotation. He had dismissed it as a cartographer's peculiarity, a misnomer for a landlocked pond. But the island had no ponds. It had only the sea and the rock and the creeping fog. A new understanding, cold and sharp as the Maine wind, began to etch itself into his thoughts. The lighthouse wasn't merely a beacon against the storm. It was a lure, a mechanism. And he, Raj, was not merely its keeper, but its latest component. He felt less like a man making a discovery, and more like a puppet whose strings had finally been tightened, drawing him inexorably towards his preordained role. The air in the lighthouse tower grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else. Something ancient, metallic, like wet rust and forgotten things. The lamp, usually a comforting hum, now resonated with a deeper, almost guttural thrum that vibrated through the iron stairs beneath his boots. He ascended, each step a deliberate, heavy act, his determination a brittle shell against the overwhelming pressure building around him. He wasn't fighting it anymore, not truly. He was being drawn, an iron filing to a colossal magnet. Raj felt a profound alien intelligence pressing against the edges of his perception. A vast, indifferent awareness that had slumbered beneath the waves for millennia, now stirring, hungerously. It was not malevolent in a human sense, but simply there. An ocean's crushing weight made sentient, seeking its due. He reached the top, his breath ragged, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The panoramic view of the churning gray sea, usually a source of grim beauty, now felt like an accusation. And there, in the distance, partially obscured by the lingering tendrils of fog, he saw it. The frozen lake. It wasn't a lake at all. It was a wound in the earth, a gaping maw. His academic mind, once so keen on dissecting forgotten lore, now scrambled to piece together the fragments. The cryptic warnings from the islanders, the strange disappearances, the lighthouse's inexplicable construction over a site of ancient forgotten rituals. The lighthouse was not meant to warn ships away from danger. It was meant to guide something to it, or perhaps to keep something contained. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration emanated from within, a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo not in his ears, but directly in his skull. He saw the intricate gears, the polished reflectors, the powerful bulb, and suddenly understood. The light, that powerful rhythmic pulse, was not merely a navigational aid. It was a heartbeat, a summons, a feeding. The keepers, he realized with a sickening lurch, weren't just maintaining the light. They were part of the light. They were the conductors, the sacrifices, their very presence, their sanity, their life force, feeding the ancient thing that lay dormant, or perhaps merely waiting, in the frozen lake. Raj's vision blurred. The lines between the lighthouse, the sea, and his own consciousness began to dissolve. They had all come here, drawn by the isolation, the promise of quiet, only to become ensnared. Each one, in their own way, had perpetuated the cycle. There was no escape. There was only the continuation. His own determination, the very drive that had brought him here, was just another facet of the entity's influence, drawing him deeper into its web. He was not fighting it. He was fulfilling its ancient design. He placed both hands on the warm glass of the lamp, feeling the tremor within. He could hear, faintly, the rhythmic pulse of the light, now seeming to synchronize with his own fading heartbeat. He was a tuning fork, resonating with an ancient, terrible frequency. He saw the endless cycle stretched before him, a procession of doomed keepers, each one a fresh vessel, a new source of energy for the thing in the frozen lake. He was the new keeper, and his role was not to break the cycle, but to maintain it. With a shuddering breath that felt like it wasn't entirely his own, Raj turned the final mechanism, adjusting the lamp's focus. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift that felt monumental. as the powerful beam cut through the last vestiges of the night, slicing across the distant obsidian surface of the frozen lake. A faint, deep thrum resonated from below. It was a sound that reached him not through his ears, but through the very rock of the island. A sound of vast, slow satisfaction. The horror did not end. It merely settled. The light pulsed, relentless, unwavering. His face was devoid of expression, his gaze distant, yet somehow intensely focused. He was trapped, irrevocably changed, a silent sentinel for an unspeakable horror, his sanity a fragmented memory. The light shone and the cycle continued, unbroken, its new keeper in place. The sea churned, indifferent, its ancient secret still held fast in its crushing depths. And in the frozen lake, something stirred, briefly, before settling back into its patient, endless slumber, fed by the rhythmic beat of the lighthouse, awaiting its next due. Raj was there and would always be there, a part of the mechanism, the lighthouse's new eternal keeper.